The Legend of Zelda. Easily one of the most iconic video game franchises of all time, with more than 18 games released in a span of nearly 30 years. The game stood out from the rest with their gripping stories, lovable characters, and beautiful artwork. In this new video series, we'll try to replicate some of the most famous items which helped our heroes save the day. To kick things off, we chose to make an item that is obtainable in just about every single Zelda game. The key! The small one, that is. The small key has been around since the very first game, The Legend of Zelda from 1986, and appeared in many that followed. Basically, Link is able to open every single door inside a dungeon, except the door to the main boss room or specialized doors. It can be found in various places, including treasure chests, being dropped by enemies, falling from the ceiling, etc. In the original The Legend of Zelda, it could be purchased by a merchant and be used in every single dungeon, and so far, this has been the only exception. Our version is from the iconic 2006 title Twilight Princess. In-game, it's styled to look very medieval, and indeed appears to be forged, but we'll come to that later. So let's jump into turning this iconic item. Our only references were pictures and seeing it in-game. Designing it in CAD took only a few hours, which seems like a lot for a 3D designer, but it's a good time for a 3D constructor because every single frame, chamfer, etc. had to be measured from the desktop, scaled into real life by using various other references, calculated, and then worked into the CAD model. It's a complete solid model, not just assemblies thrown together. Now the task was to choose a fabrication method and a material. This step would take far too long to explain, so here's a short version. In-game, the key looks like it's forged from steel by hand. Steel is hard to work with in our workshop, and even harder to forge with our equipment. Plastic would be unrealistic in weight and hard to texture like the forged key, and brass, copper, tin, or lead would either be too expensive or too soft. Therefore, aluminium is the material we went with. We intended to cast the key at first, but then found out that making the mold would be too difficult. So we sent the 3D model to have a prototype made. This was done by a technology known as fused deposition modeling, which is able to create a small plastic part like this in just a few hours for a price of about $30. However, for that you get a really bad surface finish. After a few failed attempts to smoothen the surface, we nearly binned it. Instead, we decided to use this as a reference for making the actual key. Now, for the actual production procedure. We started by taking a leftover aluminum disc and facing both sides on the lathe. Next, we drilled a pilot hole into the center and then enlarged the hole until we reached our largest drill with 16 millimeters, equal to 0.6 inches. The final diameter of the hole was made using a boring bar, which also left an extremely good finish. This would be the basis of our key. Next, we needed to make the hole hexagonal. We did that by taking the disc to a tool and die workshop. We wrote a program for a CNC-controlled milling machine and machined out the hex. Sadly, filming in the facility is strictly prohibited, which is why we can't show you any pictures of the actual process. Back at the workshop, we started milling the flats for the shaft, the teeth-like triangles, and the lower hanging slot. All of this was done using several milling cutters and a string of paper to determine the angles of the flats, and although this looks like a dodgy solution, it actually worked out pretty well. That was the easy part done. At that point, we'd also created several AutoCAD 2D drawings to use while machining, each one marked with clear dimensions. First was the shaft extending out of the ring. After milling the stock to size, it was painted blue and then fine lines were scratched onto the paint as reference for the milling operation. The shafts for locking and unlocking were made the same way. The slot for the hanging block at the end was milled into a piece of aluminium and then the chamfer was just filed out. The teeth for the ring took so long to mill, chamfer, and cut to size that we didn't even bother to record it. As you may have noticed, the shafts are all pointy at the end. We did that by grinding points on a normal grinder. So we had all the single parts ready, but how would we connect them? Welding them together would leave a huge weld line and ruin the whole key, and any other technology would recommend changing the design of the key. That's why we decided to just glue it all together. We did that by using a professional 2-component glue, which is able to be hardened within 20 minutes in a normal oven and can hold up to 396 pounds of weight. The hanging block, main shaft, and teeth were all glued on and held in place by a homemade fixture using mainly spoons, a miniature vise, and metal parallels. For gluing on the shaft, we filled a triangle-shaped hole, glued them on the shaft, and it hardened in the oven. After the gluing was done, the key was looking pretty good, but the surface was kinda rough and dirty. That's why we sandblasted the whole key using quite a coarse blasting sand. After blasting was done, the key had a crystalline but matte surface. Now it was time to do the last step, which is getting the forged dark look on the aluminium. The first type of paint we tried was a modern sort of hammer paint, which is supposed to create a texture that looks like it was hit with a hammer, like in forging. However, it didn't look anything like that. While looking for an alternative, the owner of an old local hardware store told us that the classic hammered paint isn't produced anymore because it contains poisonous materials such as cobalt oxides. They did, however, have a few cans of this paint left. The result of this paint looked astonishing. It created a very rough, matte texture that looks as though it just came out of a blacksmith. So that's it for this episode. Please be sure to leave a like and tell me in the comments what you think of our replicas and the series in general. And if you have any ideas for what Zelda item to make next, let us know in the comments and we might take a look at it.